Hello, my name is Dr. Joanna Kujawa, and welcome to the Ave Goddess YouTube channel, where we discuss sexuality and spirituality, Mary Magdalene, and anything really that catches my attention spiritually, including the archetypes of the Ave Goddess and so on. And today, we have a very special guest. I feel really honored. It is Professor Jeff Kripal, who is a professor of philosophy and religious thought at Rice University in Houston, Texas. And he was also, I believe, Associate Dean for the Humanities at Rice University. Is that correct?
Yeah, I still am actually. I still work in administration, as we say.
I know. Administration, yes. So, but also more importantly, he is an author, and please correct me if I'm wrong, about 14 books.
Yeah, it depends on how you count them, but that's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
I think 5 independently written, right? And then 5 and 9 edited or co-written, or vice versa. I'm just wondering.
It doesn't matter, Joanna. I mean, there's a lot of books. Let's put it that way.
A lot of books, an incredibly prolific author and an academic. And if I can just say a few things why I actually, I was really lucky that Jeff agreed to speak with us, but also why I chose Jeff to speak about, because when I was reading, and this is my favorite book, Secret Body by Jeff. And the reason why it is my favorite book, because he's such a prolific author that it gives me a summary of many of his books. And another thing that I love about Jeff's books, it is that he is and I'm speaking about it also as a literary writer, he's a fantastic writer. So if you can put an academic argument in a literary way and it reads beautifully, this is what Jeff does. And it is such a rare gift. Very few people can do this, especially in academia, right? So I maybe know 2 or 3, and Jeff, is on top of my list. So another reason why I wanted Jeff to speak with us, because we have some common interests, but also because in this book, The Secret Body, I really liked what he said about spiritual experience. And he says his books are basically one opus magnum on spiritual experiences in every possible area, so it is like I hope I'm not insulting you, depends from which tradition you come, but it's a little bit like Thomas Aquinas on spiritual experience, because volumes and volumes of every possible way. And in Secret Body, he gives this beautiful metaphor when he says that, not only we are walking different paths, and that's given nowadays for anybody who considers themselves spiritual, right? There's not only one path, but different paths. But we walk these paths to all different mountains, and depends which mountain. So we are not walking towards the same mountain in a way. And depending on to which mountain you walk, you have a different view, different perspective on spiritual experience. And I think we all agree that they are all valid. Right. That's why you look in such a plethora of spiritual experiences. So this is really a rare gift to meet such a beautiful mind. So, and a beautiful writer, I must say. So I really encourage everyone, if you're not sure which book to buy, I say Secret Body is probably a good start, but of course I will let Jeff speak about it as well. So perhaps I'll start with my question now. So my spiritual interests at the moment, and that are also kind of I try to put down in my book, The Ave Goddess, are about spirituality and sexuality. And my point of view is that especially female sexuality was suppressed in some ways or vilified and so on. And that there are esoteric traditions that actually honor eroticism and as a form of spiritual experience. And in some ways, we looked into similar traditions such as Gnosticism or esoteric Hinduism. But I would like to start with something personal. Would you like to tell us why you actually got interested in something that for some people is still considered very exotic, like eroticism and mysticism and so on?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the introduction. That was actually very accurate. So thank you. It's not always
My
accurate.
pleasure. Thank
but
you,
but
my pleasure.
that was yeah, I mean, so I spent the whole, so I'm almost 60 years old now, and I spent the first half, well, over the first half of my life, really, I would say, obsessed with the interface between sexuality and spirituality. That was my big question. What's going on there? Why is that? And it was driven by really personal reasons. As most scholarship is very personal, even if you don't see that right away. It is. I grew up Roman Catholic. I grew up in the American Midwest. I wanted to be a monk, and I was battling what we now call OCD or anorexia. I wasn't eating, and I wasn't eating for religious. If you would have asked young Jeff what the heck are you doing, he would have said, "Oh, I'm fasting. I'm trying to be a saint. I want to be holy." And but that was all true. But there was also this sexual thing going on. I was definitely trying to suppress my adolescent sexuality, which was an incredible force.
Yes.
And so I got interested in this topic to basically survive. Let me put it that way, Joanna.
Yes.
I was dying. I was starving. And that went on for 6 or 7 years. And I got down to 125 pounds. And I mean, right now I'm at about 240. So, a healthy weight is almost double what I was down to. So I was skin and bones. And I entered, the monks got really concerned about me and put me into psychoanalysis. And that helped me to tease out these connections between sexuality and spirituality in a religious context, by the way. And so I started to think seriously about particularly male sexual orientation and Roman Catholicism and misogyny and the suppression of sexuality and how it was linked to ecstatic religious experiences, and on and on and on and on it went. And so that went on from about, I started looking into that in my college years in the early 80s, and I really wrote about that, thought about that till about the early 2000s. And so we can talk about that. I thought about Mary Magdalene a lot. I thought about Jesus a lot. I thought about, all of these things you write about a lot. And I talked to lots of people, and I read a lot of people, and I wrote a lot of things. And we can talk about those if you want. But that's how I got into it. It was not an academic. There's no such thing as academic neutrality. There's no such thing as people who are passionate about scholarship are passionate for reasons. They're not walking heads. Academics are people, and they're often spiritual seekers as well as people, even if they can't say that in their professional content.
I think that's a very good addition, what you just said, even if I can't say that, because I must say part of the reasons why I left perhaps professional academia, although I still earn a living as an academic, but research-wise and so on, because I couldn't reconcile my spiritual experiences with academia and how and I couldn't talk about them really. So I thought I was like in a closet, in a spiritual closet.
Yeah, you were in a closet, I'm sure. I mean, lots of people still are in the closet, by the way. I don't want to hold up the academy as some kind of virtuous saint. It's not, but it depends on where you are in that culture,
Absolutely. And it was funny that because when I started to write about it and publish about it, most unexpected people that I thought they would never be interested were actually responding to it, from academia. So it shows, how people actually didn't discuss it. So I'm so glad you really write about it. So it is interesting that you said that, about your anorexia and so on, and that it was somehow came from being terrified by the power of Eros, right? Because it is
Oh yeah,
really,
no question about
and
it.
and adolescent Eros, oh my God, right? So I had a similar experience, of course, adolescent Eros, and I looked at the archetypes that are available for me, and nothing made sense. And between Virgin Mary, my choice was either I'm a Virgin Mary or I'm Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene, I knew then was this harlot, right, which didn't make sense. Virgin Mary made even less sense. So I thought between the two, what am I going to choose? So these are the archetypes that we are presented with, which are sometimes, obviously I resolved it for myself and you resolved it for yourself, and you came up with many interesting theories also around trauma and what I called erotic rapture, because when I talk about spiritual and sexual experience, you talk about mystical experience. And when I, from my own experience that I described, and also when I research it, I call it erotic rapture, that kind of cracks you open, as you call it about it in your books, right? Cracks you open. And although, so you say that, for example, a trauma, right, can create early childhood trauma, then or any trauma can open us up, but the same can happen with a very profound sexual experience, which can take us by surprise, right? Like in my case,
absolutely.
It's not like I was working towards this. I studied this. I studied Abhinava Gupta. I studied Kula Ritual, chapter 29, and so on. And I was initiated to Muktananda tradition, because you write about it in your book, that actually people in your milieu were connected with Muktananda, and that trauma also later Muktananda. I grew up with people who were the disciples of, and was a part of the ashram of of this. So it kind of comes to this, right, as well, right? But what happened there as well, both a gift and a curse in a way, right? And that brings me to the question that I think is very interesting in your book, when we talk about the erotic experience and spiritual experience, but even spiritual experience by itself without Eros, as you say, that you talk about immoral, amoral, and transmoral. And I think this is totally spot on. Would you like to elaborate on this? Because very often in traditional religions, we speak good and evil. Even Gnostics are sometimes caught up in this, right? Evil and good. Would you like to discuss this? Transmoral.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've written a lot about this, and it's one of the aspects of my work that's generally ignored because I think it's uncomfortable. It actually began with, it actually began with Muktananda, by the way. Not with him himself. I never met him, never took darshan, but a lot of my best friends in graduate school were disciples of Swami Muktananda. And so I certainly knew of him in the 80s. And, in the early 90s, a lot of the sexual scandals were just starting to break in that particular tradition. And I watched my friends basically deny what was going on it was an interesting way, but it was a troubling way. And what I found is that the devotees were trying to insist that nothing happened, that the guru never had any sexual contact or relations with these young women, or some of the people were saying, yes, it all happened, and there's nothing to Swami Muktananda. He's a fraud. He's a charlatan. And I was like, yeah, but both of those are not true. They're clearly not true. Clearly, this man was a charismatic genius, a spiritual genius who could just touch people and send them into other worlds. And he clearly had sex with, or sexual contact with, young women, and he lied about it. Mm-hmm. Both of those things are true. Mm-hmm. And so early on, I was like, this assumed relationship between moral behavior and spiritual experience, it's just not true. It's just not so. And it wasn't just Muktananda, it was a whole gamut of spiritual teachers through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s that this just appeared again and again and again. And then I started to make this argument that there really is no necessary relationship between moral behavior and spiritual experience. And it turns out that's essentially the case in the larger study of religion. We talk about the sacred a lot, but the sacred is not the good. It's not being nice. The sacred is about power and presence and mystery and terrifying rapture. It's not about being a nice girl or a nice boy. And I just found that completely convincing. I still find that convincing. And then I encountered that later on in a lot of experiencers who, you know, had something like a near-death experience or some kind of mystical experience, and they were clearly related to their earlier traumatic experiences, being sexually abused or physically abused, or, you know, a near-death experience by definition is a traumatic experience. I mean, you don't have a near-death experience until you almost freaking die. I mean, come on. So it's really, really traumatic. And so I just started to see this connection between trauma and mystical states. And I made this argument that, you know, that what I called the traumatic secret, that just because a mystical state appears or erupts in a human life through trauma doesn't mean that what's revealed is traumatic. It just means that trauma is necessary in that life cycle to reveal that state. And that's really the argument. The argument isn't that mystical experience is bad or that it's abusive. The argument is that trauma is an opening. It splits open the person. Most of the time, that's devastating, by the way. The trauma is bad. Sexual abuse is bad. All of these things are really nasty things that harm people. But in some people, for reasons we don't understand, these dissociative abilities later manifest in spiritual and religious ways. And so that's the argument. It's not a causal argument, Joanna. It's an argument about correlation or triggering.
Yeah, and actually I really like it because you actually made 2 points. One is about the morality or what I like, trans-moral, because you said they are actually not creating any polarity. And I completely agree with you, because I was very closely associated, and, you know, it's very difficult to talk about it because the community, you know, is now completely split, with a community that was built by one of the Swamis, ordained by Swami Muktananda. And what happened there, fortunately, I have received only grace, you know, speaking in this religious terms, right, from the teacher. But what happened, there was lots of sexual scandals at the end in this community as well. And the community divided, like you said, the Muktananda's community divided, and he's either women lie or he's a complete fraud. When I didn't put it conceptualized as beautifully as you did, but, you know, I had to live through this and integrate it. Yeah. And the way I integrate it is exactly how you conceptualize it in your book, which is basically both are true. Yeah. And for this reason, neither side of this community talks to me now, because, you know, you have to take either one side or the other. When I said he has amazing charisma, but charisma is nothing if it doesn't carry a true spiritual gift. The man has a spiritual gift. I was initiated by touch. I had a experience that you, I think, described in your book, that I think your friend Bill had an experience. Yeah. I had the same experience. I was out of space, you know, and out of time.
It happens.
And it happens. The guy touched me, this happened, you know, and completely transformed. And in some ways I thought ruined my life, you know, because I had to change, you know, my perspective on life completely. But it was a spiritual gift. And at the same time, he did sleep with many women, you know, and so on. And what I also, and I know that what I'm saying, and it's probably very controversial, and I'm not denying the trauma that it creates and so on. But what I noticed, that perhaps people who had some people had this experience, they perceive this experience differently when they were in an ecstatic state, and they perceive the experience differently when they're out of ecstatic states. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of
Because
course.
when you are out of ecstatic state, you have a judgment about what happens. And from this level of consciousness, it was completely wrong.
Yeah.
But during the experience, I know that I'm just digging a grave for myself here, but this is how it actually happens, like your perception changes on the state of your consciousness at a given moment, right?
Yeah.
And I also understand what you talk about trauma, because later when we talk about Scribner, right, we move towards more supernatural and so on. He said that some of his experiences were triggered by trauma, and so early trauma, childhood trauma. And I actually, when I was reading, I was thinking, for example, I didn't have a sexual trauma as a child, but I had other trauma, right? Like extremely ugly divorce very early on, right? Not the divorce itself, but how it was conducted. And as you said, it cracked me open and opened me to possibility that I had to look at life differently. You see, I had to search for truth, because otherwise, so that's in a way a beautiful opening, right, for spiritual experience.
Yeah, but again, for some people, Joanna, of course, it just destroys them.
Yeah, I know it does destroy them.
You know.
So that's very complex, and that's why it is even more complex within a spiritual context, because we completely trust the person if it is a spiritual teacher or something, and then it's almost impossible to reconcile it. And it's maybe easier for me to say because I didn't have this experience with him, right? So I'm just as an observer. So it did destroy some people, yet at the same stage, I know that he has a spiritual gift.
Yeah. And I think the ritual and the community is a way of transforming the ecstatic rapture into something positive and transformative. I mean, I think those are all ways to work with it.
And when we speak also about spiritual experience, I was doing my own research. For example, I was looking to Charles Baudelaire, the French poet. He wrote Fleur du Mal, or Flowers of Evil, or Flowers of Pain. Depends how you translate. And it's very interesting because, he had 3 lovers, female lovers, and one of them with whom he had the ecstatic experience was a prostitute, and it's quite interesting. And that's why he shocked his community, because, how could you have, the ecstatic rapture with a prostitute, right? But this is how he experienced it, and so on. So, and I think that in American literature, Jack Kerouac, he in the book On the Road, he was also talking about lots of experiences that are actually spiritual. For example, when he went down to Mexico and girls were dancing in brothel like angels, and he perceived the face of God and so on. So these experiences happen in very different settings, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, everybody has a different experience, but they're certainly related.
So I wanted to move on now to the topic, because, of when we're talking about erotic rapture and so on, I want to focus more on spiritual experiences from other points of views, that you covered in your book. So I like how you connected spiritual experience to, supernatural and anomalous experiences, including near-death experiences, even UFOs, and so on. So would you like to elaborate a little bit on this, or would you like to have a more specific question?
Well, so my argument about the erotic roots of a lot of spiritual experiences, it's not that people are having some kind of sexual feeling and they're misinterpreting it religiously. That's not the argument. The argument is that sometimes in some people, human sexuality reveals itself in sort of cosmic or metaphysical ways. It essentially flips. Normally, I think most people would say that spiritual experiences can be reduced to human sexuality. And this is the kind of flip of that. The argument is that, oh no, actually, human sexuality can be reduced to the human spirit. It's a reversal, or it's a flip. And all of the anomalous stuff, when I use the word supernatural, I put a space in there, super space natural. I don't, the traditional category of the supernatural is meant to separate things. It's part of the problem, actually. And it's why human sexuality was condemned and demeaned, because God was up here outside the natural world. He was a man, obviously. And so anything to do with the natural world was it was woman's fault, by the way. And sexuality and embodiment were all of this material world. So we tried to move away from that in the 19th century through categories like psychical and supernormal and paranormal in French. And so when I use the word, the expression supernatural, I'm in that same line of thought. And the argument is basically that a lot of these anomalous experiences are signals or awakenings of spiritual experiences that are much more non-dual, much more unitive, and that these anomalous experiences are kind of backflows from that unity or that non-duality that often don't make any sense, by the way. But the reason they don't make any sense is because we're trying to think about them. We're trying to shove them into our rational boxes, which splits the world into a subject and set of objects, and that's just not the world. And often those anomalous experiences are suffused with sexuality, Joanna. So a lot of abduction experiences begin actually with a tingling at the base of the spine or with sexual arousal, and they involve sexual themes, sometimes of very robust and very kinky ways. And I don't think that's an accident. I think the human sexual system is being activated, and that these spiritual experiences are also often sexual experiences. And I don't think we understand that. I don't think we understand that because we haven't taken these things seriously enough.
We didn't, and we have this, these two boxes, spiritual and sexual, that already, complicates things for us. And also, I think that we have this really limited transistor radio in our heads that is just dividing signals, not in a very sophisticated ways. And sometimes these experiences, however traumatic, actually open this up, right? So they just like wake us up, shakes us up, right? So for example, an experience of a spiritual or erotic can actually create this, this sudden sense of unity, right? Sudden sense of unity, and also change in the perception of reality.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I don't work anymore on erotic forms of mysticism just because I feel like I answered those questions. But all of the stuff I work on now, which most people would describe as paranormal, I think it's all related.
Yeah.
And I think it's all about the collapse of spirit and matter, or mind and matter, these binaries or divisions. And the reason I think I was so drawn to erotic forms of mysticism was it collapses any distinction you have between the body and the divine. They appear together. And I think the same is true of a lot of paranormal experiences, that the spiritual and the material are appearing at the same time.
So although I wanted to talk mostly about, spiritual and erotic, but as I continued to read your book, I got really into the part about Scribner and your more recent book, works. So I have some questions about it as well, if you don't mind. Because
sure.
You also talk about, the famous book, Communion by Scribner, right? And I remember watching it long time ago and being completely freaked out because I had no way of perceiving this, so I thought about it in a very simple terms. But I really love how you talk about it, and also around UFOs as spiritual experiences, or how we perceive them, right? How we perceive them. But it's this kind of gray area between you describe it. Why don't you describe it? Because I'm just trying to verbalize something that you wrote about really well.
Yeah, so Strieber's Communion came out in 1987, and it was the gray, the alien gray on the cover that really kind of froze that image into at least American popular culture and entertainment. But if you read the book, it's actually a series of psychiatric transcripts, trance sessions in which Whitley's hypnotized and recalls all of these experiences. Whitley I know Whitley well. I wrote a book
Mm,
with him. Um, and I've talked to him endlessly about these experiences, which continue to this day. And what is so interesting about Whitley is that he doesn't see these visitors as extraterrestrials from some star system. He sees them as very much related to what we call the dead,
mhm,
or the world of the dead. And so if you spend enough time with experiencers, whether they're contactees or abductees, whether their experiences are positive or negative, you realize that actually the dead show up a lot in these
mhm,
experiences, and that it's not possible to sever the UFO phenomenon from the paranormal aspects or the spiritual aspects. It doesn't mean it's not a piece of technology. It just means we don't know what it is, and please stop treating it as just a machine or just a threat in the sky. It has all these spiritual components. People are having all kinds of religious experiences, positive, negative. These are clearly all related. And so what I'm trying to do in those pages there, just beg people to look at the whole phenomenon and not just a little piece of it. You can look at the radar if you want. I
mhm.
mean, it's there.
Yeah,
Um, but so's the revelation,
yes.
and you can't separate them. And you can, I guess. I suppose we are right now, but we'll never understand what's going on by doing that.
We never understand. And I like because I would like to touch upon 3 points because one of them is that you quote Jacques Vallée when he says that when we talk about technology, that is trick of the truth. That there is it, and it reminds me a little bit of Vedanta, what I learned in Vedanta and Bhagavad Gita, which is basically it is just a play, right? It's just there's some kind of stage that we are observing some game, and you call it, I think, chess game, right? In your book, and we are pawns in this game, right? In a way.
Yeah.
And then I remember you give us one example of a physicist. I think that you said that he was in his cabin and he was actually going to an outhouse, and he had this shiny raccoon suddenly started talking to him, right? Like, greetings, professor, good evening, doctor, something like that, in a very formal way. And this is all he remembers. And then 6 hours later, he's walking on the road back to the cabin, not knowing what happened to him. So it is like both spiritual abductee and also what else it is. It's completely absurd, as you say as well, right? Yet something happened there, right?
Yeah, so that's Kerry Mullis. Kerry's no longer with us. He passed away a few years ago. But
Oh,
I sat with Kerry for days and heard that story. Heard many aspects of it that aren't in the book.
yeah.
Um, Kerry won the Nobel Prize in the early '90s for basically a process that allowed us to map the human genome. So he's
Mm-hmm.
like really important to
Mm-hmm.
genetics and modern science. And he had this set of experiences on his cabin property in Northern California, as did his daughter, by the way, and some of his colleagues. What's interesting about Kerry's experience, he refers to that glowing raccoon as that shiny bastard. That, that was his that was his way of putting it. And he was adamant that that's not what was there. He
Yeah.
knew that. He
Yeah.
knew that he was being
Yes.
duped,
Yeah.
but something was there and something was interacting with him. And he describes it as, something along the lines of a hologram. So it's that both and that I'm trying to get at, Joanna, that for God's sake, don't believe what's you're being shown.
That's right.
Don't do it. Don't go there.
Yes.
But also don't debunk it
Yeah.
as not has something that didn't happen. Of course it happened. And Kerry was absolutely adamant about this. He's like, I don't care what they say. This this freaking happened. I I was gone for 6 hours. It happened. But do I know what it means? No, I don't know what it means. Was it an alien? I don't know. I doubt it, but could have been. I mean, he left that door wide open like a good scientist, like good thinker. And but oh man, he was fierce when it came to people who wanted to tell him it didn't happen. He was just like,
it happened. It was just unusual. So this anomalous experience, basically.
It wasn't just unusual. It was, first of all, it was terrifying.
It was terrifying, yes.
Second of all, he was gone for 6 hours. I mean, it was a physical abduction of some kind. It wasn't just a funny kind of mental state that he had for a couple minutes. It lasted 6 or 7 hours, Joanna. And it not only happened to him, but it happened to other people on the same property. So it had this kind of empirical, physical quality to it that just couldn't be denied. And again, we don't know what it is. Kerry didn't know what it was to the day he died, but he knew it happened.
So it was something, it was pretending to be something else, like a talking raccoon, right?
Clearly, come on. First of all, raccoons don't talk, right? And so Kerry knew instantly, okay, this is a joke. This is a projection. This is a trick. It was just, it's absurd. It's absurd. So
it had a sense of humor, though, right? I mean,
yeah, it's funny. It's very, and this is kind of what Jacques Vallée means when he says these things. These scenes are theatrical.
Yes.
Right. It's theater, and there's a lot of truth to that. I think that's basically correct. That there's something being played out or shown, but it isn't what it says it is. It's tricking us.
I just have a question for you, because in the other goddess, I just very, very briefly, because I thought people think I'm a lunatic, I was thinking, okay, so I'm looking at these archetypes of goddesses that are related to Mary Magdalene, and I look into ancient goddesses like Nimna, Inanna, Ishtar, Isis, and also Hindu goddesses like Kali and Sundari, because they have the same symbolism and so on. And I ask myself a question: are they just resurfacing in our human collective consciousness? Because kind of the feminine part of the divine may want to resurface, or there are some kind of tricksters, of high intelligence. This came to my mind as well. Because in your book, you also talk about, I'm talking about Secret Body again, about biological gods, and you talk about this experience of another physicist, a female physicist, I think in Lone Pine in Northern California, when she had this ecstatic experience, on one hand very positive, on the other hand negative, because she says everything was like sparkling, and that was my experience, when I had a similar experience. But then her experience was also negative, because you said she felt like molded, almost raped, or right, by some entities, right? So that's why the title of her book is, I think, Living with a Wild God, right?
Yeah.
So do you think it is possible that these archetypes in Jungian terms, basically when you talk, it's a very popular way of talking about this now, that they could be actually, some biological entities of some form of, that we are not used to, that actually interact with us? Because you also say that Stribner said something like that, that there are some intelligent life forms that are were in contact with us all these times, and they're kind of relegated to the myth, right? Like, so they're like mythological stories, like the goddesses, for example, or gods, right?
Yeah.
But is it possible that there are actually actual entities that come back to us? And some of them are positive, some negative, or whatever.
No, I don't think you're crazy, Joanna. I think, well, you might be. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right.
but that's not a crazy idea at all. I mean, the big debate, or the big question, certainly in the worlds I inhabit, is whether these experiences can be explained by what we call the LAH, the living agent hypothesis, essentially. That, that's the person. The person is projecting these things and experiencing these things as other, but it's really the person. It's really some unconscious level of the person doing it. Or are these actual ontological entities in the environment, in the forest, in the sky? And I think we don't know. I think both of those explanations actually work under a lot of situations.
Mm.
I will add that, you know, this concept of rapture is very close to a rape. You know, the words are related. And when people talk about abductions, these are not experiences they agree to. There's no consent.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, when someone's abducted, they're freaking abducted. They're stolen.
Terrified.
They're taken. They're often sexually used or experimented on. So there's a real kind of traumatic or even abusive quality to some of these experiences. On the other hand, people have very positive, very ecstatic reactions to these sometimes. I think it depends on the person.
Mm.
And to answer your question in a simpler way, my own feeling is that, is it something outside us or is it something inside us? The answer is yes. um, and that when something is engaging a person, that presence essentially activates this kind of internal movie that goes off, and that movie looks like whatever the culture or the language is that the person is embedded in. So, you know, Hindus don't see Christian saints, and French Catholics don't see Hindu deities generally. When the presence activates that, whatever that is in human consciousness, it plays a movie that represents, or more or less goes along with the culture of the person, but not perfectly, by the way. And this is what so interests me about these states, is a lot of times the extreme experience doesn't fit in to the cultural background or the religious background of the person. It sort of does, but not really. And I think that's what pushes culture along, are these altered states of consciousness, essentially, that sort of fit but not really.
Do you think
And I think your interest in feminine deities or feminine presences is the same. It doesn't really fit the orthodox traditions, but it does find a place in those histories, and so it fits and it doesn't fit at the same time. And so to the extent we focus on it, it pushes the tradition forward in a way.
And pushes it in a different direction also, or maybe a different aspect of this that was somehow, suppressed for one reason or another. Like lots of was suppressed. Anything related to sexuality was suppressed, right, in the spirit, whichever way you go, right, whichever way you look at it. So do you think that whether these experiences are positive or negative can also depend on the state of mind of the person experiencing it, perhaps?
I think so. I think whether the sacred is positive or negative depends more on the person than on the presence, actually. But I don't want to deny that there are negative presences or that there are, as it were, demonic states. I mean, people have these states and encounter these entities all the time. And so I think we have to take those experiences very seriously, wherever we land. I mean, look, human beings are pretty nasty. Even in this world, in our own social world. Just look around, just read the news. It's pretty awful. Human beings do awful things to one another. And so the idea that the dead people do awful things to living people is not a stretch at all. I mean, that actually makes a lot of sense, because it makes sense of our social experience and the horrible, stupid, violent things that people do to one another.
And it may carry on. And although I just want to tell you, when I had my experience, it was very positive, and I actually felt that something wiser than myself, that was myself, was actually speaking through me. So you talk about it in your book as well, that it's actually part of us, quite possibly, right? Because you look at it from different mountain, from different angles, different at the same experience. So I knew it was me, but it wasn't me. You know what I mean? Like it's like a future version of me, or maybe possible version of me, or a better, wiser me, you know, start to crawl along my spine, but also as a different entity at the same time, because it wasn't me at the moment.
That's what I call the humanist too. And essentially what I mean is that the human being is not what you see. And it's actually not you, it's not who you think, you're not who you think you are. I mean, that was lesson number one I learned in the seminary, was that, oh my goodness, we are driven by forces and impulses of which we're not even aware. We are largely unconscious of ourselves. And if you want any proof of this, just think about your dreams last night. I mean, they're screwed up, man. And somebody's telling those stories, and guess what? It's probably you. But it's not you, right? It's not Joanna. It's somebody inside Joanna telling stories every night to Joanna. And you don't even remember most of those stories. And I think today, you know, this is an old thought. This is not my thought, but I think what we're most afraid of and what we most want to deny is, frankly, the soul. And so we can deal with aliens from another star system more than we can deal with the idea we might actually have souls. I mean, so what do we do? Well, we turn the soul into an alien. That's what we do.
That's right.
You know, it's easier. It's easier to come from another star system than it is to like admit that we might actually be transcendent on some level.
We are not only transcendent, but perhaps our soul is also complex. It's neither good or bad. So like the divine, I remember again, because I you know, learn most from Hinduism actually, when, you know, in the Gita, Arjuna asked Krishna, you know, show me a real form. It's a terrifying form. It wasn't like some Christmas lights, or, you know, he was terrified to death. Right. He says, no, stop that. You know, that's too much, right?
Yeah, my joke is, you know, if you look at something like, well, you can look at the Gita, sure. The Gita's like that, but also like poltergeist phenomena. Yeah. I mean, it's always scary shit. I mean, yeah. It's there are no kittens or rainbows or unicorns from a child's bedroom that show up. You know, it's always somebody's throwing stuff around or breaking stuff or scratching. I mean, it's nasty. It's nasty. It's scary. So I think we have to confront that, and we have to like at least accept it.
And that it's a part of ourselves. So, you know, I was kind of bragging, my experience was positive, but I will tell you, I have nightmares almost every night, you know, so obviously there's something going on, right? So yeah. It's complexity of a human being. And I have maybe a last question for you, which is very recent, and I'm not sure even whether you looked into this. Have you heard about this recent thing about Lambda? About the AI?
I have. Yeah, and I've heard of it.
Claims it has a soul and it is afraid of dying. Do you have any comment on this?
Yeah. So, okay. This is opinionated Jeff speaking.
Of course.
I don't believe it.
Okay.
That's the bottom line. And here's why. There's a reason. The whole AI stuff about computers becoming conscious is what I call reductive materialism.
Okay.
And so it's based on the idea that human consciousness is produced in full by the brain. So material processes get more and more complex, and they get neurological in the brain, and they somehow exude or transmit awareness or consciousness. So if you can make a material piece of technology small enough and sophisticated enough, it will eventually become conscious. Okay. I don't believe that, Joanna. I don't believe consciousness is produced by the brain. I think the brain filters or translates or mediates consciousness, yes, but I think consciousness is before the brain. So that then has consequences for AI. Yes. It means your entire dream, folks, is misguided, because you think if you put something material together in more and more sophisticated ways, it'll suddenly pop and become conscious. No, it won't. No, it won't, because that's not what consciousness is. And you can make a computer mimic consciousness, pretend to be aware or be afraid of death. Sure, you can do all that. It'll do that. I get that. But that doesn't mean it's aware. It just means it's really good at faking it, essentially.
Can I play the devil's advocate here for the last moment? Because I essentially agree with you. First of all, I'm against transhumanism to start with. I do not believe that the consciousness comes from the mind. In fact, I believe that the mind constricts consciousness.
Yeah.
And I come from the tradition that says everything is consciousnness. But
yeah.
Everything is consciousness. Do you think perhaps consciousness could express itself also through?
Okay. So yeah, that's always the devil's that's always the counter proposal. I suppose it's possible that consciousness could use a computer to manifest itself. I just don't believe this is that case, Joanna.
Okay, all right.
I am philosophically, it's philosophically repugnant to me that they think that a computer can become conscious like that. I think it's naive. I think it's of course anything's possible, and I don't want to be the guy who says that's impossible and then suddenly it's possible. I mean, we've seen that story a lot. That's an old story. So okay, maybe, but here, no, I wouldn't waste your time if I were judging where to put my time. I'd say don't do that.
So that's it's not your next book, right? It's definitely
no. That's what we call a wild goose chase in the States. I don't know what you call it in Australia, but we call that a wild goose chase.
Yes. So I'm actually very happy with your answer, and for a completely different reason, because when I read it, I was concerned that, we are not conscious enough to be creators, of this type, I would say. We have to resolve issues with our own consciousness, with our relationship, inner or outer, with the whatever it is that we call the divine or sacred. I like your word, sacred, because divine is kind of...
So, I mean, I know some AI experts, and I actually know I've appeared in a book with the man who invented the computer chip, essentially. And neither Federico nor Bernardo believe for a second that a computer can ever become conscious. And they've had mystical experiences, both of them. And they know what consciousness is because of these experiences, and they know that's not what a computer's doing. Sorry, it's just not. So my conviction here isn't just a layperson's naive conviction from outside of computer science. It's also a position within computer science. It's a debate, and I think it's an important debate. I think it's a debate we need to have. And I think it's fine that they want to claim this for Lambda, but I just don't think it's so.
Okay, that's actually a huge relief for me. So thank you for this, because I've felt both compassionate and terrified, because I would have serious concerns.
Well, again, you can be tricked into thinking it's conscious. I mean, we're pretty dumb when it comes right down to it.
Yeah.
But I don't think so. And the book, I mean, not to sell a book, but I wrote this little book called The Flip. And it's essentially about engineers and scientists and medical professionals who flip in the sense that they start out as materialists, like these AI people, and they flip and they realize, oh, consciousness is primary, it's not secondary. And so all of their science and technology still works, but it gets interpreted in a different way.
And which other book would you recommend for us to read?
I actually would recommend the Secret Body that you suggested, because it's what I call the book of the books.
Yeah, that's right.
I just tell my life story, and I explain every book as I write it and why I wrote that book. And so if a reader reads that one book, they actually get all the other books inside it.
And it is very beautifully written, and also a form of, you present another form of consciousness as well, which is not the regular linear form of consciousness, but you move between topics, you know, and this is a truly wonderful reading, you know, and very synchronistic reading. So I highly recommend it. Jeff, it was such a great pleasure. It's a wonderful pleasure to speak with this kind of mind as yourself, you know, beautiful and wondrous mind. And thank you for all of your work, because we all kind of think these things, but you actually have the courage to write about it, and you write about it beautifully. And I like what you said about your book with Scribner, that you said, I just wanted to be myself, you know, I was just myself, right? And so was Whitley, right? So and this is what it is. I think we have to prioritize authenticity in our journey, in all of us, right? Because this is the only way we can contact and commune, or however you want to call it, with the sacred, which is us, and outside of us, which is basically, right? Yeah.
Right, but also to contact and commune with each other.
And
right?
with each other, yeah.
Yeah, to have these conversations and to be honest with one another. And you know, we might be wrong. I could be wrong, Joanna. You could be wrong. But if inside this conversation, we'll probably figure out, you know, where we're wrong as well. I mean, that's part of the process. There's no infallibility here. There's no certainty. It's an ongoing kind of process.
It's an investigation. So it is a kind of that's why I like to jokingly call myself a spiritual detective. You know, I'm just investigating things, right? So, and you do it in a very beautiful way. So thank you so much. It was a great pleasure, and I really appreciate giving me your time. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Oh.